challenged with the task of trying to pull things together in terms of the wide-ranging discussion that we've had today. So what I've done is I've tried to think about things in general ways and try to weave them together. And what we've created is, in fact, 4 domains or areas. When they are wound together, they form a tapestry, which I'd like to then present to you as a way of reflection of what we've been talking about. So obviously it's my way of seeing or hearing, and you must take from it what you want, and you must discard what you don't like about it. But in essence, what we were set as a task for today was to think about how to transform this food system in which we're existing. How do we move it to something that ultimately is about nourishment, about nourishing the nation or Southern Africa or ourselves with this connection to nature, life, and in order to perpetuate life. And so that has been our task. And so the way I've thought about it is in these 4 domains, and I'll go through them quietly. The first echoes what Gogo Dineo said in terms of the complexity of the system in which we're thinking, and how in order to deal with complexity, we've got to engage with the head and the heart. That if we just have scientists or economists or political scientists or psychologists dealing with it, we're not going to get there. We need people with passion who are embedded, who are thinking, who are able to immerse themselves into that complexity in order to push it forward. It echoes much of what Colleen and her colleagues at Rios Partners really enable us to do. Bonang earlier this morning said, the problem that we face in South Africa is well articulated, that people are not reaching their potential after 25 years of democracy. And what's key is that the food system is at the core of that. We can't deny it, that it's the core of the economy, it's the core of society, it's the core of how we are recreating ourselves. And Tatiana and Kululi were very clear about some of the ills that the food system is spawning. There is stunting and undernutrition, overweight and obesity. And yes, there is efficiency in terms of production, and there are these things that are positive. But generally, there's something that is wrong, that is difficult, that is holding us. And Donna helped us think a little bit about that in terms of let's being clear in that complexity to think about power and people and the voice of the hungry in terms of these processes. So we engage with this in terms of our head and our heart. We immerse ourselves in that complexity, but we put power at the center. So that's the first. The second comes a little bit from a conversation I had with Sue, which was about how we're beginning to regain a sense of our connection to food and to nature and to ourselves, and how important that is. So food for people, echoing Donna again, but also food as this absolute integral part of the living world. So we see nature as a natural resource or an ecological resource or a resource service, these things about extraction. But food is at the kernel of what it is to be alive. And so we've got to be thinking about it in terms of a living world. And perhaps that helps us think about questions of food as medicine, food as a diet within nature's limits, the beauty and wonder of food, rather than it in terms of a resource which we extract. Very early this morning, we heard Vuyo Kanyile. He made a little statement that I think was very powerful. He said, healthy choice is positive for the environment. We need a food system that is regenerative, that gives back to nature more than it takes. And that was, in many ways, compelling. And it was exemplified in terms of the Living Planet Award. So Morne du Plessis, he introduced it with the sentence, we've got to find ways of binding well-being of people with the well-being of nature. And this award captured that in the most spectacular way, where Sissy and Nikki were able to talk about how to regenerate a landscape, and arguing that the degradation was leading to the poverty, was perpetuating the poverty. And by regenerating, they were beginning to deal with things that have challenged Pretoria for 25 years, and they were showing success. And perhaps if we think about that landscape as a food system, how do we regenerate that in ways that are compelling? And then two very practical examples were given. Zola said, in terms of our connection to food, we've got to build our own knowledge of what we're eating or cooking or buying. And she completely demonstrated that to us in terms of then that connection to food. And then Nikki said earlier on, what is the provenance of what we are eating? Well, that's a really amazing statement. Provenance essentially means, what is the source of origin? Do we know the origin of our food? And if we're asking those two questions in terms of how we are preparing and cooking and engaging with food, but also from whence it's coming, that helps us then be completely engaged and reconnected to food. So that's the second domain. The third is a little bit more conceptual, but I'm going to play with it a bit. And that was that in many of the discussions, particularly the panel now, that the group was arguing that we need to be thinking systematically or systemically and holistically about the longer-term solutions that underpins this transition that we're looking at. A transition which creates food that's safe and nutritious. Otherwise, it's not food. That was clear. So how do we think systematically? So a food system approach is often an academic term that's thrown around. We heard a bit of it today. So I try to think a little bit, what does that really mean? So for me, a food system approach is one where we engage people or the actors at all the levels, all the parts of the system to reshape it to ensure that it enables nutritious, safe, affordable, and sustainable food. So let's stand back and think about what that is. So one big part of it is the agricultural sector that enables, that creates that food that is needed for healthy and affordable diets sustainably. And Wandile gave some inputs in terms of thinking about tech and seeds and ways of thinking around efficiencies. That was immediately contested by others in the room that were thinking about seed sovereignty, agroecology, and rights. It's not easy, but that's the one domain of the system that's then connected to how that food then moves from the land towards people. So some economists would call that food supply chains that deliver. And we've got to be thinking about how that works in ways that are ecologically and economically viable, but that supports livelihoods. We're not creating jobs, we're creating livelihoods. Again, if we think about retail and we think about large and big supermarkets, it's going to be contested about what that component of the system is. The third component of the system is about food environments that make healthy diets available, affordable, and acceptable. So that's a place where we go to get our food. It's the shopping center, or it's the spaza, or it's somewhere in the countryside. That environment is shaped by structure, by people bringing that food there that set up arrangements and laws. That's the next component of the food system. The fourth is about people actually wanting and being able to eat that healthy, nutritious food. So you have that structure, but you've got to want a desire to go in there to get the healthy food. And maybe we don't have enough of that. And the fifth component is that people are actually eating nourishing food. So that is what, for me, is the system. How we create it in terms of the land, how we connect it, the supply chains to the environment, where we get it, the demand of people wanting that food, and then actually eating it. And we've got to be thinking about it in all of those ways. So that's and I think Zola, again, you captured it when you explained the potatoes, from whence the potato came to where it went, and you gave a little historical thing. That is that system. So that's the third. The fourth and the last is very much about the multiple actors operating at the different levels and scales. So just to start with the hidden hands, and this was Donna's point, that when we think about the actors, it's easy to categorize groups into civil society and private and this and that, but we really need to look inside about who those actors are. And the hidden hands are those that are often completely marginalized, those that are forced aside, those that are possibly most hungry, most in a situation of vulnerability. So just to put that as a preface to then thinking about these big domains of actors. So the one we often think about is the state, who sets the rules of the game. They're supposed to create an enabling environment. They distribute resources, so they push taxes. They create incentives for us to act in certain ways and disincentives. So that is in very main a big domain of the food system in terms of actors that are operating there. The next is the private sector. And Flo picked this up. He said, the private sector in South Africa are probably the most important set of actors, formal, informal, large, medium, and small, because they are, in very many ways, the investors into the system, that are holding the system, that are moving food, that are taking, and let's be honest, taking profit along the steps of the way. And they are driven by that imperative. So Bonang made the point earlier on that yes, we've got to be societally responsible in terms of the private sector, but we've got to do well by doing good, because we need a very, very different attitude in South Africa. And he captured that very well. The third domain, civil society, and where, in many ways, is when we are not perhaps having a hat on that's in the private sector or elsewhere, but as people, in terms of our power to support those responsible or accountable, but to hold them to account, to shame those that are perhaps acting contrary to the way we wish this nourishing system to work. So the Legal Resource Center, for example, is thinking about a right to food and litigation. That's an example of saying, state, you're obliged to look at the right to food. You're probably failing. We're going to litigate the hell out of you. That's about holding account. But it's also about saying private sector has a role to play in that as well. So what is the state then doing to moderate what the private sector is doing, and then the private sector to then re-engage? And so we see the interconnectedness between all of these, and the point being that the solution lies with those interconnections and in many ways through dialogue. So in summary, how do we transform the food system towards this nourishment, towards this nourishing outcome? It's about engaging the head and the heart with complexity. It's about connecting to the sense of what food is, to the living world, to ourselves. It's thirdly about thinking and working systemically and holistically across the system. And fourth, it's about understanding the actors and the interactions and enabling the way we work with those interactions. Thanks very much.